There is a kind of person who plans everything, who arrives at a meeting with notes already prepared for the questions that haven't been asked yet, who lies awake before a difficult conversation running every possible version of it so that nothing will catch them off guard, who holds their relationships, their reputation, their daily schedule, and their long-term future inside a mental architecture of such careful construction that any unexpected change to any single part of it feels not like a minor inconvenience, but like a structural threat. If you recognize this person, it may be because you have been them, or because you are them right now, at this exact moment, holding something tightly enough that your hands have forgotten what it felt like to be open. The grip doesn't feel like fear from the inside. It feels like responsibility. It feels like the reasonable behavior of someone who takes their life seriously, who understands that things go wrong when you stop paying attention, who has learned, usually from experience, that the world does not naturally arrange itself in your favor and that only sustained effort and careful management keep the chaos at bay. And this is not entirely wrong. Attention matters. Preparation is real. But there is a point, and most people who live this way have crossed it without noticing, where the management of life begins to cost more than the life itself is producing, where the energy required to maintain the architecture of control leaves almost nothing for the actual experience of being alive inside it. Michel de Montaigne watched this happen to everyone around him, and then, more honestly, he watched it happen to himself. Montaigne lived through a period of history that treated the ambition for control as a measure of virtue. 16th-century France was a country convulsing through religious civil war, political assassination, plague, and a social order that could collapse around any individual life without warning. The response of most serious men of his era was to grip harder, to align themselves with the right faction, to manage their reputation with precision, to place their bets carefully and tend them constantly. Montaigne spent a significant portion of his early adulthood doing exactly this. He served as a magistrate, worked the political corridors of Bordeaux, performed the roles his station demanded, and he was, by the standards of his world, competent at it. What he discovered, through years of that competent performance, was that the performance was costing him something he could not name at first, and could not stop noticing once he had. He described it later with a characteristic directness that makes him feel, across 5 centuries, like someone who has just looked up from the same thought you were having. He wrote that he had spent years living as if his actual life were the preparation for something else, as if presence were a luxury he could afford once the management was complete. He was waiting, in other words, for control to finally deliver the peace it had always promised. It did not deliver. It only raised the price. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a personal failing. It is the structural problem with control as a strategy for peace, and it runs like a fault line beneath the psychology of every person who has ever tried to build their way to stillness. Control is predicated on a premise that cannot survive contact with reality, which is that the future is something you can, with sufficient effort and intelligence, predict and therefore manage. But the future is not a problem with a solution. It is a horizon that moves as you approach it. Every outcome you successfully engineer produces a new set of variables you did not anticipate and cannot entirely manage. The person who needs to control their environment to feel safe will find that the environment always contains one more thing that needs controlling. The peace they are working toward keeps relocating, just slightly ahead of wherever they currently are. Montaigne's response to this, once he had named it clearly enough to respond to it, was not to try harder or to refine his methods of management. It was something that looked, from the outside, almost like surrender. He began to practice what he would eventually describe as one of the most difficult arts available to a human being, the deliberate, conscious release of his claim over outcomes he could not actually determine. He called this learning to live with fortune. Fortune for Montaigne was not luck in the casual sense. It was the name he gave to everything that exists outside the boundary of the self, the weather of history, the behavior of other people, the movements of health and sickness through a body, the 1,000 variables in any given situation that no amount of attention could fully control. And his argument was not that fortune is benign, or that things work out for the best, or any of the comfortable formulations that philosophers sometimes retreat to when the alternative requires more courage. His argument was simpler and harder. Fortune exists. It is not yours to manage, and your refusal to accept that fact is making you less capable, not more. Here it is worth stopping, because this is where Montaigne gets misread, most often, and most damagingly. What he was proposing is not passivity. He was not arguing that effort is futile, or that preparation is a waste, or that you should approach your life with a kind of pleasant, unfocused drift. He remained, throughout his life, a man who worked at things, who maintained his estate, who wrote with extraordinary discipline and care, who fulfilled his obligations as mayor of Bordeaux during one of the most difficult periods in that city's history. What he distinguished, and this distinction is the entire point, was the difference between effort and attachment to outcome. You can work hard toward something and release the result. You can prepare carefully and remain genuinely open to what actually arrives. You can care about your life without treating every deviation from your plan as evidence that something has gone wrong with the universe. The failure to make this distinction is the source of most of the suffering that looks, on the surface, like simply caring a lot. The person who cannot distinguish between their effort and their attachment to the outcome of that effort does not experience their own competence as a resource. They experience it as a debt that reality keeps failing to repay. Every outcome that doesn't match the plan, and outcomes almost never match the plan entirely, registers as a failure of control rather than as the normal behavior of a complex world. Over time, this produces a very specific kind of exhaustion, not the clean tiredness of genuine exertion, but the grinding fatigue of someone who has been fighting a battle that could not, in principle, be won. Now, there are two ways people typically try to solve this problem, and Montaigne watched both of them fail with the patient attention of someone who had already tried the first one personally. The first is the attempt to control more, to identify the point at which control slipped and reinforce it, to add another layer of preparation, another contingency, another system for managing the variables that escaped last time. This is the trap that flatters competent people most effectively because it looks like learning from experience. In reality, it is the escalation of the same strategy that created the problem, applied with more energy to a situation that the strategy was never equipped to resolve. The second failure is the overcorrection, a kind of performed detachment, the decision to stop caring as a way of stopping the pain of things not going as planned. This is not peace. It is numbness wearing peace's clothing. Montaigne had no patience for this either. He cared deeply about his friendships, his writing, his work, his experience of being alive. What he relinquished was not care. It was the demand that his care be repaid by a particular set of outcomes. What remained, once the demand was released, is the thing that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, because it doesn't look dramatic enough from the outside to seem like the answer to anything. Montaigne described it as a quality of presence, the ability to be where he actually was, doing what he was actually doing, without a significant portion of his attention already living in the managed future he was trying to construct. He wrote about eating a meal and tasting it, about a conversation with a friend that didn't have a purpose beyond the conversation itself, about walking in his garden with something he called, in his characteristically understated way, sufficient contentment. These are not the descriptions of a man who has achieved enlightenment. They are the descriptions of a man who has stopped subtracting himself from his own life. And this is what actually changes when the grip loosens. Not the circumstances. The circumstances of Montaigne's life remained, in many respects, genuinely difficult. He suffered from kidney stones, with a pain he described in clinical and unsparing detail. He lost friends to plague and politics. He watched France tear itself apart around him with a ferocity that no individual act of management could have addressed. What changed was not the world's willingness to cooperate with his preferences. It was his relationship with the gap between what he preferred and what arrived. That gap, which had once been a source of constant low-grade emergency, became simply the texture of a life being lived in contact with reality rather than in opposition to it. True peace, in Montaigne's understanding of the word, is not the state you arrive at when everything is finally in order. It is not the reward waiting at the end of sufficient control. It is what becomes available when you stop treating the present moment as a problem to be solved before the real living can begin. It is not passive, and it is not achieved. It is something closer to a continuous choice, made again and again in the face of a world that will not hold still and a self that will not stop wanting things. The choice to do what you can with what you have, and then, and this is the part that costs something real, to let the outcome be what it is. Montaigne made that choice imperfectly, repeatedly, across decades, and wrote about the imperfection with the same honesty he brought to everything else. He did not claim to have resolved the problem of fortune. He claimed to have found a way of living alongside it that left room for something he valued more than the feeling of being in control. That something was, simply, being here, in the garden, with the cabbages, with sufficient contentment, without waiting for the conditions to finally be right. The conditions will never be finally right, but the garden is there now, and so, if you're willing to put down the blueprint for a moment, are you?